Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was born in Fullmetal Alchemist with the power of alchemy. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The sun over Resemble was a benevolent, molten gold, spilling its warmth across rolling green hills that seemed to breathe with the gentle rhythm of the wind. The air, clean and sweet, carried the scent of freshly cut grass, damp earth, and unique to this particular corner of the world, the faint, sharp tang of machine oil and hot steel. It was the smell of home. In the distance, the rhythmic clang, clang, clang of a hammer striking metal was the town's unwavering heartbeat, a testament to the Rockbell family and their legendary automail. For most children his age, a day like this was an invitation to adventure, a call to chase grasshoppers through the fields, to raise sticks in the creek, or to play at being soldiers or state alchemists. For 10-year-old Izuku Midoriya, however, the world was not a playground to be conquered, but an intricate system to be understood. He sat on the porch steps of Rockbell Automail, a worn, leather-bound notebook open on his lap, a graphite pencil clutched in a surprisingly steady hand. His wild mop of dark green hair fell into his equally green eyes, which were narrowed in intense concentration. He wasn't drawing heroes or monsters. He was sketching the town's communal water pump with excruciating detail. Not just its shape, but its inner workings, the piston, the seals, the flow of water, the fulcrum of the handle. The volumetric flow rate is inconsistent, he muttered, his voice a low, continuous hum just beneath the chirping of crickets. If the primary gasket were made of a vulcanized rubber composite instead of treated leather, the seal would be approximately 12.7% more efficient, especially during the dry season, but that would increase maintenance costs. Equivalent exchange, the cost of efficiency versus the cost of materials and labor. There's always a balance. The whole world is a transmutation circle, if you look at it right. His muttering was a constant, a familiar background noise to anyone who knew him. It wasn't madness, but a symptom of a mind that ran too fast for his mouth to keep up. Where others saw a simple pump, Izuku saw a complex equation of physics, chemistry, and economics, all bound by the fundamental laws of nature, the very same laws that governed alchemy. "Oh, Deku! Are you going to sit there and whisper sweet nothings to that notebook all day, or are you going to actually live in the world?" The voice, sharp but fond, belonged to Winry Rockbell. She stood in the doorway, hands on her hips, her bright blue eyes sparkling with a familiar exasperation. A smudge of grease decorated her cheek, a perfect accent to her determined expression. Izuku jumped, the pencil skittering across the page. Winry! I was just analyzing. The pump's efficiency is a fascinating problem. Winry sighed, a sound that was half laugh, half groan. It's a pump, Izuku. You pull the handle, water comes out. The only problem is when Ed breaks it by trying to see how high he can launch a bucket. Now come on. Granny Pinako made lunch, and if we don't get there before Ed, all that'll be left are the crusts. Izuku carefully closed his notebook, treating it with the reverence of a holy text. It was Alchemy Analysis for the Future, Volume 4. He had started the series when he was 7, an orphan with a restless mind taken in by the gruff but kind Pinako Rockbell. He was a cuckoo in her nest of mechanics, a boy of theory in a house of practice, but they had made him family all the same. He followed Winry towards the small house next to the workshop, his shorter legs working to keep up. His gaze drifted across the yard to where the subjects of Winry's complaint were currently engaged in their favorite pastime, a loud, flashy, and fundamentally chaotic display of alchemy. "Behold, Al! The ultimate defense!" Edward Elric, a boy of equal age to Izuku but with a confidence that seemed to make him a foot taller, slammed his hands onto the ground. A small, hastily drawn transmutation circle flared with brilliant blue light. The earth groaned and buckled, erupting into a jagged, poorly formed wall about 3 feet high. His younger brother, Alphonse, stood beside him, his gentle soul encased in a small, human body for now. He clapped politely. "It's amazing, brother! But isn't it a little lumpy?" "It's not lumpy. It's reinforced. For tactical advantage," Ed retorted, kicking at a loose clump of dirt. His golden hair, tied back in a neat braid, swung with emotion. He radiated an energy Izuku found both captivating and terrifying. Ed didn't just perform alchemy, he commanded it, bending the world to his will with nothing but his knowledge and his sheer, unadulterated nerve. Izuku watched, his analytical mind kicking in again. The energy output was immense for the result, he thought, his muttering instinct bubbling up. He wasted at least 30% of the potential energy on light and sound. A more complex circle, one that accounted for soil composition and moisture content, could have created a wall twice the size with the same effort. The structural integrity is compromised by the rapid, uncontrolled transmutation. He admired Ed's raw talent, the way alchemy seemed to flow from him as naturally as breath. He was a prodigy, a force of nature. But it was Al's quiet curiosity and gentle spirit that Izuku connected with. While Ed was demonstrating, Al would often sneak over to where Izuku was sitting and peer into his notebook. "What did you figure out today, Izuku?" Al had asked him just yesterday, his voice soft. Izuku had eagerly shown him a page filled with equations. "I think I've found a way to apply alchemical principles to reinforce steel during the forging process, not by transmuting it, but by using a circle to precisely control the carbon distribution at a molecular level as it cools. It could make automail limbs lighter and stronger." Al's eyes had widened. "Wow. You think of things nobody else does. Ed just thinks about making things bigger or making them explode." That was the difference. Ed saw alchemy as a tool of creation and power. Izuku saw it as a tool of understanding and restoration. He didn't want to make a stone fist to punch through a wall. He wanted to understand the wall so perfectly he could deconstruct it brick by brick and rebuild it stronger than before. "Lunch!" Winry yelled, finally breaking through the alchemical spectacle. Ed's wall crumbled back into the earth with a flick of his wrist, and the three of them raced towards the house, leaving Izuku to trail behind, his mind still buzzing with the inefficient beauty of it all. Life in the Elric household was a warm and vibrant thing, a stark contrast to the quiet, orderly world inside Izuku's head. The source of that warmth was Trisha Elric. She moved through her home with a gentle grace, her smile a constant source of light. She treated Izuku not as a stray her neighbors had taken in, but as a third son. "Izuku, dear," she said that afternoon, finding him curled in an armchair, poring over a dense textbook on metallurgic alchemy from her absent husband's study. "You'll strain your eyes reading in this light." She lit a nearby lamp, its soft glow illuminating the complex diagrams on the page. "Always studying. You have a brilliant mind, you know." Izuku blushed, ducking his head. I like to know how things work. Everything is connected. The iron in the ground, the iron in our blood, the iron in an automail limb, it's all part of a larger system. Alchemy is just a language that describes the system. Trisha's smile was tinged with a soft melancholy. "My Hohenheim used to say things like that. He saw the world as a grand piece of music." She coughed then, a small, delicate sound that she tried to hide behind her hand. Izuku noticed. He noticed everything. He noticed the slight tremor in her hands some mornings, the way she seemed to tire more easily, the pale, almost translucent quality of her skin. His mind, so good at identifying patterns in inanimate objects, couldn't help but see a worrying pattern forming in the person who had shown him so much kindness. He didn't have the data to form a conclusion, but he had a hypothesis, and it filled him with a cold, quiet dread. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, the four children sat on the porch steps. Ed was boasting about how he'd be the youngest state alchemist in history. Winry was arguing with him about a wrench he'd lost. In the midst of the comfortable chaos, Izuku took out his notebook and showed a new page to Alphonse. "See?" he whispered, pointing to an intricate, multi-layered transmutation circle. "This is a restorative array. In theory, it could be used to repair damaged tissue. It's not healing, not really. It's cellular reconstruction. It takes the base organic materials, carbon, water, phosphorus, from a nutrient-rich slurry and uses them to rebuild damaged cells according to their original structure." Alphonse looked at the drawing, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You mean, you could use it to fix a cut without a scar?" "Potentially much more," Izuku said, his voice gaining excitement. "With enough understanding of biology, of the human body's own alchemical processes. You could theoretically repair organs, fix broken bones in minutes. It's all just reorganizing matter. The problem is the complexity. The amount of information required to reconstruct a single living cell perfectly is staggering. One mistake in the array, one miscalculation of the required elements, and you could create a cancerous growth instead. It's dangerous. Everything worth doing is dangerous. Ed scoffed, having overheard them. He snatched the notebook from Izuku's hands, his golden eyes scanning the page. This is amazing, Izuku. You're thinking about this all wrong, though. Why stop at fixing a cut? Why not make people better? Stronger? Izuku snatched his notebook back, hugging it to his chest. That's not the point. The fundamental principle is restoration, not enhancement. It's about returning to a state of equilibrium. Pushing beyond that, that's when the exchange becomes unbalanced. The price would be too high. You and your prices. Ed sighed, rolling his eyes. He clapped his hands together and, with a flash of blue light, transmuted a handful of pebbles into a perfect, glittering marble. He tossed it in the air and caught it. See? Simple. You think too much, Deku. That's your problem. You're so busy reading the rules you forget you can just play the game. He ran off into the yard, Al trailing after him. Izuku stayed on the porch, staring down at his complex equations. He couldn't shake the feeling that Ed, for all his genius, was missing the single most important part of alchemy. It wasn't a game. The law of equivalent exchange wasn't just a rule, it was a cage, and if you tried to break its bars, it wouldn't be the bars that shattered, it would be you. The day the music died in the Elric house, the sun was shining. Trisha's illness had progressed with a silent, merciless speed. The boys had watched, helpless, as the light in her eyes faded. The day she passed away, a stillness fell over Resemble, as if the whole world were holding its breath. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and quiet weeping. Izuku stood beside Pinako and Winry, his small hands clenched into fists. He wasn't crying. His mind had detached, retreating into the cold comfort of analysis as a defense mechanism. He observed the stages of grief in others as if they were chemical reactions. Ed's grief was a volatile, explosive compound of anger and denial. Ael's was a slow, corrosive sorrow that dissolved his spirit from the inside out. In the weeks that followed, a heavy, suffocating quiet filled the Elric home. The boys locked themselves away in their father's study, surrounded by books that promised infinite knowledge. Izuku tried to reach them, bringing them meals that often went untouched, but a wall had been erected between them, a wall built of grief and a single, terrible idea. He found them one evening, hunched over a massive, leather-bound tome in the center of the study. The room was a mess of discarded books and frantic chalk drawings. The air was thick with the smell of dust and desperation. On the open page before them was a diagram that made Izuku's blood run cold. It was a complex, circular array, filled with symbols he recognized from the darkest, most forbidden corners of alchemical theory. It was a human transmutation circle. What are you doing? Izuku whispered, his voice trembling. Ed looked up, his eyes wild and red-rimmed, but burning with a terrifying new fire. We're going to fix it, Izuku. We're going to bring her back. The floor seemed to drop out from under Izuku. He felt a wave of nausea, his analytical mind screaming at the sheer, unadulterated hubris of the statement. No, he said, his voice barely audible. He took a step forward, his hands outstretched. Ed, you can't. It's impossible. Nothing's impossible. Ed slammed the book shut, raising a cloud of dust. We're geniuses. We know more about alchemy than any adult in this town. We have the knowledge right here. Knowledge isn't the problem. Izuku's voice rose, cracking with a desperate urgency. His muttering started, a flood of uncontrolled analysis pouring from his lips. The law is the law, Ed. To create something of equal value must be lost. Human transmutation is forbidden for a reason. Do you understand the components? The data? You can get the water, the carbon, the ammonia, the lime. It's all listed right there, a shopping list for a body. But what about the soul? What about the information? How do you reconstruct a person's memories, their personality, their being? What is the equivalent exchange for a human soul? It's an unknown variable. It's a flaw in the fundamental equation. You can't solve for x when you don't even know what x is. The price would be unknowable. It would be catastrophic. He was hyperventilating, his own words terrifying him. He grabbed Ed's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. Please, Ed, don't do this. Think. For once, just stop and think. For a moment, he thought he'd gotten through. He saw a flicker of doubt in Ed's eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by a stubborn, grief-fueled resolve. Ed roughly shook his arm free. What would you know? He snarled, and his words were sharper than any blade. You're not like us. You just read and scribble in your little notebooks. You're a coward, hiding behind theories because you're too scared to actually do anything. We have the power to bring our mom back, and you want us to just sit here and do nothing? This is our family. Our mom. You wouldn't understand. The words struck Izuku like a physical blow. You wouldn't understand. He was an outsider. A stray. An orphan who had never known his own mother, now being told he couldn't comprehend the pain of losing one. Alphonse, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. He's just worried about us, brother. He's scared. Ed corrected, his gaze fixed on Izuku, cold and unforgiving. If you're not going to help, then stay out of our way. He turned his back on Izuku, and in that moment, the wall between them became solid and impassable. Izuku stood in the doorway, frozen, his frantic warnings dying in his throat. He had presented all the data, pointed out the fatal flaw in their hypothesis, but their conclusion was being driven by emotion, not logic. And against the overwhelming force of a child's grief, his logic was powerless. He backed away slowly, the image of the forbidden circle burned into his retinas. He had failed. He couldn't save them from themselves. 2 days later, the sky was a bruised purple, threatening a storm. Pinako Rockbell, her face etched with a worry that mirrored Izuku's own, called him into the workshop. Izuku, she said, not looking up from the complex gearing of an automail wrist she was assembling. I need you to run an errand for me. I need a rush order of tungsten filaments from the supplier in East City. The train leaves in an hour. Take this money. And take your time coming back. Maybe stay the night at the inn if the storm gets bad. Understand? Izuku understood perfectly. She wasn't just sending him on an errand. She was getting him out of the house. She had seen the same darkness in the Elric boys that he had. She knew something was about to happen, something she couldn't stop, and she wanted to spare him from witnessing it. Yes, Granny, he said, his voice hollow. He packed a small bag, his hands moving on autopilot. He took his latest notebook, but he didn't feel any desire to write in it. His mind was a maelstrom of fear. As he walked to the train station, every step felt like a betrayal. He was running away. He should have done more. He should have stolen the book, erased the chalk circles, physically dragged them out of that room. But Ed's words echoed in his head. You're a coward. Maybe he was. The train ride to East City was a torment. Every clack of the wheels on the track sounded like a tick of a clock, counting down to disaster. He stared out the window at the passing countryside, but he didn't see it. He saw transmutation circles, flawed equations, and Trisha Elric's gentle smile. He completed the errand in a fog, his interaction with the supplier barely registering. As he stepped out of the shop, the storm finally broke. Rain fell in thick, cold sheets, plastering his green hair to his forehead. The sky, which had been purple with warning, was now a roiling black. An omen. He couldn't wait. He couldn't stay the night. An agonizing certainty gripped him. He had to go back. He ran to the station, catching the last train heading west, back towards Resemble. The journey back was even worse. The rain lashed against the windows, and with every flash of lightning, Izuku imagined a different kind of light, the brilliant, terrible blue of an alchemical transmutation. He clutched his notebook to his chest like a shield, his heart hammering against his ribs in a frantic, syncopated rhythm with the storm. It was well after midnight when the train pulled into Resemble's small station. The storm had lessened to a steady, miserable drizzle. The streets were dark and empty, the houses quiet. The air was heavy and thick, and it carried a strange smell. A smell Izuku's analytical mind immediately began to deconstruct. Ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. Copper, like blood. And something else, something acrid and deeply, fundamentally wrong. He began to walk, then jog, then break into a dead sprint, his worn boots splashing through puddles. He didn't need to see the house to know. He could feel it. A deep, sick wrongness had settled over the Elric home, a stain on the fabric of reality itself. As he rounded the final corner, his eyes fell upon the house. It was dark, silent, but from the gaps around the windows and under the door, he could see a faint, pulsing, sickly red light, a light that had no natural source. His breath hitched. His legs felt like lead. He forced himself forward, one step at a time, his mind a screaming void of his own worst predictions come to life. The price would be unknowable. Catastrophic. He reached the front door. It was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the damp breeze. He pushed it open. The smell hit him first, a staggering, physical blow. It was the smell of a butcher's shop and a lightning storm combined, iron and burnt air, so thick he could taste it. The pulsing red light emanated from the center of the living room, from the scorched, blackened remnants of the human transmutation circle he had warned them about. The intricate chalk lines were now filled with a viscous, crimson substance that seemed to drink the light. His eyes struggled to adjust to the gloom, to process the impossible, horrific tableau before him. He saw the suit of armor first. It was one of the decorative suits from the hallway, but it was standing now, in a clumsy, unnatural pose. A strange, glowing red rune, a blood seal, was painted on the inside of its neckpiece. A small, tinny voice, distorted and filled with a child's terror, echoed from within the metal helmet. "Brother!" Then, his gaze fell upon a small shape huddled on the floor near the circle's edge. It was Edward. He was conscious, barely, his face pale and slick with sweat and tears. His right arm was gone, sheared off at the shoulder in a mangled ruin of flesh and bone. His left leg was also gone, a dark, spreading pool of blood soaking into the floorboards beneath him. He was gasping, his one remaining hand reaching towards the suit of armor, his voice a raw, broken whisper. Alphonse! Izuku's mind, his greatest asset, simply shut down. The analytical engine seized, overwhelmed by a horror that defied logic, that spat in the face of every ordered principle he held dear. He couldn't process, he could only see, and then he saw the final piece of the scene. The result of their exchange. On the far side of the circle lay it. The price they had paid, and what they had gotten in return. It was a grotesque parody of a human form, skeletal and malformed, draped in skin that was too tight and dark with seared blood. It was breathing, if the shallow, wet rasps could be called that. Its eyes, milky and unfocused, stared at the ceiling. It was a monument to their failure, a creature born of love and arrogance, stitched together by forbidden knowledge. It was a thing that should not be. For a long, silent moment, Izuku Midoriya could do nothing but stand in the doorway, drenched in rain, his mind shattered. The boy who analyzed the world, who saw equations in raindrops and physics in a swinging door, was finally faced with a problem he couldn't comprehend. He had seen the data, he had predicted the outcome, but the reality of it, the sight of his bleeding, mutilated friend, the sound of his other friend's voice from a metal shell, and the horrifying presence of that thing on the floor, was a truth more terrible than any equation could ever describe. The notebook, his shield and his solace, slipped from his nerveless fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud, its pages of careful analysis and hopeful theories landing in the spreading pool of his friend's blood. For a span of time that stretched into an eternity and lasted only a few seconds, Izuku Midoriya's world was reduced to the sound of his own ragged breathing and the steady, melancholic drip of rain from the eaves. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and order, had been breached, its walls crumbling into dust. The scene before him was not data to be processed. It was a wound in the fabric of reality, bleeding horror into the quiet resemble night. The initial shock, the paralyzing, system-crashing overload, gave way to a chilling, preternatural clarity. His senses, which had shut down in self-defense, came roaring back to life, flooding him with information he didn't want. The coppery stench of blood was so thick it coated his tongue. The acrid tang of ozone, the byproduct of a massive alchemical discharge, stung his nostrils. The pulsing red light from the failed circle cast dancing, demonic shadows on the walls, turning the cozy Elric home into a charnel house. He registered the pieces of the tragedy not as a whole, but as a series of disjointed, nightmarish fragments. Fragment 1: The armor. Alphonse. That was Ael's voice, small and echoing from inside the cold, empty steel. The blood seal on the inside of the gorget glowed with the same faint, crimson light as the circle. A soul bound to metal. An alchemical abomination. A successful one. Izuku's mind latched onto that with a terrifying disconnect. The soul binding was a success. The transmutation of a soul from a biological vessel to an inorganic one. The theory is possible. Fragment 2: The thing. The cost. The result. It still lay on the floor, its shallow, gurgling breaths a constant, sickening reminder of what they had created. It was the physical manifestation of their failure, a creature cobbled together from the barest ingredients of a human body, but utterly devoid of a soul. A homunculus in the most literal, horrifying sense. Fragment 3: The brother. Edward. His friend was dying. The analytical part of Izuku's brain, rebooting with a cold and terrible efficiency, catalogued the injuries with surgical precision. Amputation of the right arm at the glenohumeral joint. Traumatic amputation of the left leg, likely mid-femur. Massive hemorrhaging from the brachial and femoral arteries. Hypovolemic shock imminent. Estimated time until irreversible circulatory collapse, less than 10 minutes. It was this final, clinical assessment that broke the paralysis. It wasn't a choice, it was an instinct. A core function of his being, deeper than his love for analysis or his fear of the world, took control. It was the simple, unwavering drive to save. Al. Izuku's voice was a croak, raw and unfamiliar to his own ears. He took a staggering step into the room, his boots squelching in the blood-soaked floorboards. Al, talk to him. Keep him awake. The suit of armor jolted, turning its hollow gaze towards Izuku. Zuku! What happened? Brother's hurt. I can't feel anything. Just talk to him. Izuku commanded, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. He dropped to his knees beside Ed, ignoring the slick, warm wetness that soaked through his trousers. Ed's remaining eye was half-lidded, his gaze unfocused. His skin was clammy and deathly pale. Ed, stay with me, Izuku whispered, his hands hovering uselessly over the mangled stumps. Pressure. He needed to apply pressure, but there was so much blood, and his bare hands weren't enough. He looked around wildly. Cloth, he needed cloth, bandages, anything. His eyes landed on the floorboards beneath them. Wood. Cellulose, lignin, hemicellulose. Composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. The same base elements as cotton or linen. A desperate, insane idea sparked in his mind. Not a complex restorative array, not a healing transmutation. He didn't have the knowledge or the composure for that. But something simpler. Something structural. Equivalent exchange. His hands, slick with Ed's blood, trembled as he pressed them to the floor beside his friend. He didn't have time to draw a circle. He had to visualize it, pour every ounce of his focus, every scrap of his knowledge, into the array in his mind's eye. Deconstruct. Analyze. Reconstruct. He pictured the wood fibers breaking down, separating into their fundamental components. Then, he visualized a new structure, long, interwoven threads, bleached of impurities, forming a tight, sterile weave. A bandage. A pressure pad. Here we go, here we go, he muttered, the familiar habit returning as a focusing mantra against the rising tide of panic. Alchemical conversion of lignocellulose to a fibrous polymer, sterilized through thermal energy release, control the output, minimal light, maximum efficiency. A soft blue light, a stark contrast to the angry red of the failed circle, emanated from his hands. The floorboards beneath them warped and shifted. It wasn't explosive and flashy like Ed's alchemy. It was quiet, controlled, and intensely focused. Strips of a tough, white, cloth-like material grew from the wood, snaking upwards. Simultaneously, a thick, dense pad of the same material formed. Alphonse, I need your help. Izuku grunted with effort. He grabbed the thick pad and pressed it hard against the stump of Ed's leg. Hold this. Press down as hard as you can. Don't let go. The giant metal gauntlet of the armor was clumsy, but it did as it was told, pressing down on the pad with immense, steady weight. The flow of blood from the legs slowed to a trickle. One down. Izuku turned his attention to the shoulder. It was worse, the damage more extensive. He used the newly created fiber strips, wrapping them tightly around the wound, creating a tourniquet, then a pressure dressing, his movements swift and sure. He was working on instinct and pure theory, his mind a whirlwind of anatomical diagrams and alchemical equations. He wasn't a doctor, but at that moment, he was the only thing standing between his friend and death. The bleeding was controlled. Stabilized. But it wasn't enough. Ed was still fading. Granny! Izuku gasped, his energy spent. The transmutation had taken more out of him than he'd expected. His vision swam. Winry! I have to get them. He looked at Al. The hulking suit of armor looked so lost, so terrifyingly small despite its size. Stay with him, Al. You're his brother. He needs you. Don't let him sleep. Leaving the fate of his friend in the hands of a soul bound to armor, Izuku scrambled to his feet. He cast one last, horrified glance at the monstrous thing on the floor, which had finally fallen silent, and then he ran. He burst out of the house and into the rain, a small, desperate boy covered in the blood of his best friend, screaming for help into the uncaring storm. The days that followed were a waking nightmare, a blur of muted colors and hushed, frantic whispers. Pinako Rockbell, a woman forged from steel and resilience, took charge with the grim efficiency of a battlefield medic. She and a hastily summoned doctor from the next town worked tirelessly on Ed, their faces grim masks of concentration. Winry, her face pale and tear-streaked, was a ghost, flitting between fetching supplies and staring in shock at the empty suit of armor that was now her friend Alphonse. Izuku existed in the periphery. He had done all he could. His desperate, inspired act of alchemical first aid had saved Ed's life, the doctor had confirmed, but now he was just a 10-year-old boy, powerless in the face of medical science and overwhelming grief. He answered Pinako's sharp questions about what happened in a monotone, his mind still detached. He watched as they carried the thing out of the house, wrapped in a white sheet, and buried it in a small, unmarked grave at the edge of the property, while Ed lay in a feverish, pain-filled sleep, and Al sat silently by his bedside, a constant, metallic vigil. Izuku found himself drawn back to the source. The living room. The circle. Pinako had forbidden anyone from entering, but the door was unlocked, and the pull of the unsolved equation was too strong. He stepped inside. The room had been cleaned, the blood scrubbed from the floorboards, but the stain remained. Not a physical stain, but a psychic one. The air was still heavy with the memory of the event, and at the center of it all were the scorched, blackened marks of the transmutation circle. He took out his notebook. Alchemy Analysis for the Future, Volume 4. The cover was stiff, the bottom edges of the pages warped, and stained a rusty brown from where it had fallen in Ed's blood. He opened it to a fresh page, his pencil feeling like a familiar anchor in a sea of chaos. He began to analyze. It was the only way he knew how to process the trauma, to impose order on the incomprehensible. He knelt, his eyes tracing every line, every symbol. He meticulously sketched the entire array, his pencil strokes sharp and precise. This was not the neat, theoretical circle from the books. This was a battlefield. He noted the scorch marks, heaviest on the eastern and western edges. Massive, uncontrolled energy release. He saw the molecular degradation of the floorboards at the circle's perimeter. Alchemical blowback. He scraped a minuscule sample of the dried, crimson substance that still filled the chalk lines into a small vial. Reagent analysis required. Likely a blood component, used as a catalyst for organic transmutation. His mind began to work, connecting the pieces with a grim logic. The law is absolute. He whispered to the empty room, his muttering a low, intense hum. Equivalent exchange. They drew the circle to create a human body, so something of equal value had to be lost. He looked at the spot where Ed had lain. The ingredients for an adult human body cost next to nothing. But that's just the material, the information to construct it, the soul to animate it. That's the real currency. He paused, a terrible understanding dawning. Ed's leg. That was the price for the body. For the failed homunculus. The toll for opening the door. He then looked towards where Al had been, or rather, where he had not been. And Al's entire body, that was the price for, what? For seeing it? For the knowledge? He didn't have the answers. He was missing the key variable. The gate. When Ed finally woke, days later, he was delirious. He screamed, not from the pain of his missing limbs, but from the memory of what he had seen. He thrashed in his bed, his one remaining hand gripping the sheets, his golden eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the physical world. The gate! He'd gasped, his voice hoarse. I saw it! The truth! It was everything! All the knowledge in the universe, it poured into my head! I saw everything! Izuku sat in a chair in the corner of the room, his notebook open, his pencil flying across the page. He wasn't trying to comfort Ed. He knew he couldn't. He was documenting. The gate of truth, he wrote. A metaphysical construct? A physical place? A repository of all alchemical and universal knowledge. The price of admission is a part of oneself. A physical part. An eye, a leg, an internal organ. He looked at Ed's missing limbs, then at the empty suit of armor where Al sat. Or an entire body. The exchange is not for the material, but for the information. Knowledge itself has a price. It was a paradigm shift that rocked the foundations of his understanding. He had always seen equivalent exchange as a law of conservation of mass and energy, but this implied a conservation of information. To gain knowledge, you had to offer a part of yourself as payment. It was the most terrifying and profound alchemical principle he had ever encountered. In the quiet hours of the following nights, while the rest of the house slept, Izuku sat with his notebooks. He looked at his previous theories, his optimistic designs for restorative alchemy, his innocent belief that he could fix anything if he just understood it well enough. He saw the naivete in them now, the dangerous ignorance. He had been so focused on the how of alchemy that he had ignored the why and, more importantly, the what for. Ed and Al had used the pinnacle of alchemical knowledge, fueled by the purest of intentions, the love for their mother, and it had led to a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Their power, their genius, had not saved them. It had destroyed them. He looked down at his own hands. They were small, unassuming, not built for fighting or heavy labor. But they were steady. They could draw the most complex of circles. They could perform alchemy with a precision that even Ed, in all his brilliance, lacked. He had used that alchemy to save Ed's life. He hadn't created anything new. He had simply rearranged what was already there to prevent further loss. A new resolve began to crystallize in his heart, forged in the crucible of his friend's suffering. His old goal, to understand the world, was too passive. It wasn't enough. Understanding without action was just observation. He would master alchemy. He would push the boundaries of knowledge, just as he had always planned. But his purpose was now refined, honed to a razor's edge. He would not use it to create or to gain power. He would use it to protect. He would dedicate his life, his mind, his alchemy, to restoration. He would learn to mend broken bones, to repair damaged organs, to rebuild shattered structures. He would become a shield, a bulwark against the kind of suffering he had just witnessed. He would stand between the innocent and the terrible price of the world's equations. This silent vow, made in the dead of night in a house saturated with grief, was Izuku's own equivalent exchange. He was trading his childhood innocence for a hero's burden. A week after the incident, a sleek black car, impossibly clean and official-looking, rolled down the dirt road and came to a stop in front of Rockbell Automail. The sight of it brought the quiet hum of the workshop to a halt. Such vehicles were a rarity in Resemble, and they usually meant one thing: the state. Two figures emerged. The first was a man with dark, sharp eyes, black hair, and an air of coiled, ambitious energy that seemed to chafe under the confines of his immaculate blue military uniform. He was Colonel Roy Mustang. The second was a woman with blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a gaze so steady and perceptive it felt like she could see right through to your soul. Her pistol was holstered with a familiarity that suggested it was an extension of her own arm. This was First Lieutenant Riza Hawkeye. They were here to investigate reports of a massive, unauthorized alchemical event. Pinako met them at the door, her face a granite mask of weary defiance. She led them not to the living room, but to the infirmary where Ed was recovering. The sight of the boy, so small in the bed, missing 2 limbs, seemed to take some of the military bluster out of the colonel. His professional gaze softened with something that might have been pity, or perhaps respect. He questioned Ed, who, sullen and angry at the world, gave him clipped, defiant answers. He spoke to Alphonse, his voice calm, and even as he addressed the suit of armor, never once letting on how bizarre the situation was. He surveyed the scorched circle in the living room, his expression unreadable. Izuku watched the entire exchange from the shadows of the hallway, his notebook clutched to his chest. He analyzed the newcomers. The colonel's gloves, made of a unique pyrotex cloth, embroidered with transmutation circles. A flame alchemist. Specializes in combustion, manipulation of atmospheric oxygen density. Powerful, destructive, but requires dry conditions and an ignition source. The lieutenant's firearms, her stance, her watchful eyes that never strayed far from her superior. His shield. His protector. A perfect symbiotic relationship. Finally, Colonel Mustang's sharp eyes landed on him. "And who is this, Izuku Midoriya?" Pinako said gruffly. "He lives here." "He was the one who found them." Mustang approached, his gaze sweeping over Izuku. He seemed to take in the boy's nervous posture, the haunted look in his green eyes, and the blood-stained notebook he held like a religious text. "I see." His attention was then drawn to the floorboards near the bed. He knelt, tracing a finger over the strange, seamless patch where the wood was whiter, its grain different from the surrounding planks. He then examined the leftover strips of the fibrous material Pinako had kept. "This is a remarkable transmutation," Mustang said, his voice a low murmur of appreciation. "The molecular restructuring is incredibly precise. To convert wood cellulose into a sterile, woven polymer for medical use, that requires a deep understanding of organic chemistry. It's not flashy, but in its own way, it's more impressive than the mess in the other room." "Who did this?" All eyes turned to Izuku. He flinched, shrinking back slightly. Mustang stood up, a flicker of genuine surprise in his eyes. He looked from the small, timid boy to the evidence of sophisticated alchemy and back again. "You did this? In the middle of all that?" Izuku could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. Mustang was silent for a long moment, his gaze shifting between the 3 boys, Ed, the defiant survivor who had seen the gate of truth, Alphonse, the soul bound to steel, a living miracle of forbidden alchemy, and Izuku, the quiet analyst who had used his genius not for destruction, but for preservation. A plan began to form behind those dark eyes. An opportunity. He cleared his throat, his voice taking on a more formal, commanding tone. "Edward Elric, your illegal attempt at human transmutation is a crime punishable by death. However," he let the word hang in the air, "given your age, your survival, and the unique outcome, the state is prepared to be lenient. I see 2 boys who have made a terrible mistake, but I also see alchemical potential unlike any I have ever witnessed." He looked directly at Ed. "You want to fix your brother, don't you? You want your arm and leg back. That would require a philosopher's stone, something of a legend, but if it does exist, all the research, all the resources, all the information you would ever need is accessible through one place, the state military." He then turned his gaze to Izuku. "And you? You possess a mind of incredible precision. You use alchemy to save, to restore. That kind of talent is wasted in a backwater town. The state could give you access to libraries, laboratories, the collective knowledge of hundreds of the world's greatest alchemists. A chance to truly understand the principles you used to save your friend." He let his proposal settle in the tense silence of the room. "I'm offering you a path," he said, his voice a low, seductive promise. "Become a state alchemist. A dog of the military, yes. You'll be a weapon, used for the state's purposes, but you will also be given a research grant, unparalleled access, and the freedom to pursue your own goals. You, Edward, can find a way to restore your bodies, and you, Izuku, can find the knowledge you seek to prevent anything like this from ever happening again." It was a devil's bargain, and everyone in the room knew it. A chain, offered as a key. Ed, his eyes burning with a desperate new hope, looked at Al, and a silent understanding passed between them. For them, there was no other choice. Izuku looked at Ed, then at Al's hulking metal form. He thought of his new vow. To protect, to restore. Mustang was right. He couldn't do that here, with his handful of borrowed books and his notebooks filled with theories. He needed more. He needed the state's resources. He needed to be at the very heart of the machine, where knowledge was hoarded and power was wielded. To heal the nation, he first had to understand its anatomy, right down to the corruption in its bones. He gave a slow, determined nod. Colonel Mustang smiled, a thin, satisfied expression. Excellent. When you're well enough, you'll travel to Central City and take the exam. Prove to my superiors what I already see. He and Lieutenant Hawkeye turned and left, their job done. The black car started up, and soon it was just a dark speck on the horizon, leaving behind a house full of broken children and the heavy, terrible weight of a decision that had just sealed their fates. The price of their tragedy had been paid in flesh and blood. And the price of their hope, they were just beginning to learn, would be their freedom. 1 year. In the grand, indifferent timeline of the world, it was nothing. A single turning of the seasons. A handful of pages torn from a calendar. But in the small, wounded world of 3 boys and resemble, it was an age of transformation, an era of fire and steel and ink-stained paper. Grief, they learned, was a powerful alchemical reagent. It could corrode a soul into dust, or it could transmute it into something harder, something forged and unbreakable. The sun that now warmed the fields of resemble was the same benevolent gold, but the boys who stood beneath it were not the same. The carefree chaos of their childhood games had been replaced by the grim purpose of training. Again! Edward Elric yelled, his voice raw with effort. He stood in the center of a self-made sparring circle, a field scarred with the evidence of 100 such sessions. His automail arm gleamed, a testament to Winry's genius and his own excruciating endurance. His organic arm, slick with sweat, slammed down onto the ground. There was no circle, only the clap of his hands and the sheer force of his will. The earth erupted. A massive, snarling fist of rock, easily the size of a small cart, shot from the ground and hurtled towards its target. It was alchemy as a blunt instrument, brutal, fast, and devastatingly effective. Its target was not a person, but a wall. And behind that wall, crouched low, was Izuku Midoriya. The wall was his own creation. It wasn't a lumpy, hastily made barrier like the ones Ed used to construct. It was a marvel of defensive engineering. At first glance, it was simple packed earth, but a closer look revealed a complex, honeycomb-like internal structure, reinforced with veins of transmuted carbon running through it like black marble. On its surface, a faint, silvery sheen betrayed the intricate, almost invisible transmutation circle Izuku had etched into it. Impact in 3, 2. Izuku muttered, his green eyes wide with concentration, his hands pressed flat against the wall's inner surface. He wasn't bracing for the hit, he was preparing to react to it. Analyzing kinetic energy distribution, calculating stress points, prepared to reinforce and disperse. The stone fist collided with the wall with a deafening crack. The ground shook. Dust and pebbles flew into the air. Ed's attack was a sledgehammer, designed to shatter and destroy. But it didn't. The fist struck the wall and, for a split second, simply stopped. The silvery circle on the wall's surface flared with a brief, brilliant blue light. The kinetic energy, instead of shattering the point of impact, was instantly dispersed throughout the entire structure. The honeycomb design absorbing and redirecting the force like 1,000 tiny shock absorbers. The wall groaned, cracked spider-webbing across its surface, but it held. The stone fist, its momentum utterly spent, crumbled into a shower of gravel and dirt. From his position in the suit of armor, standing as referee, Alphonse clapped his huge metal hands together, the sound booming across the field. Amazing, Zuku! It held again, Ed grumbled, wiping sweat from his brow with his organic hand. Yeah, it held. So what? It's just a wall. In a real fight, you can't just hide behind a wall. Izuku stepped out from behind his battered but unbroken creation, pushing a sweat-soaked lock of green hair from his eyes. He was breathing heavily, his small frame trembling with exertion. It's not about hiding, Ed. It's about control. Your transmutation wasted over half its energy on concussive force that was directed outwards, not forwards. My wall didn't need to be stronger than your fist. It just needed to be smart enough to redirect the energy you threw at it. That's the difference. Blah blah blah, theories and numbers. Ed shot back, though there was no real malice in it. This argument was as much a part of their training as the alchemy itself. While you're busy calculating, the enemy is already hitting you again. To prove his point, he clapped his hands and a stone spike erupted from the ground at Izuku's feet. Izuku yelped and scrambled back, tripping over his own feet and landing in a heap. The spike was a warning, not an attack, but it made its point. This was the shape of their lives now. A tripartite pact, forged in the aftermath of their tragedy, each member pursuing the same goal through divergent, yet complementary, paths. Edward and Alphonse were chasing the Philosopher's Stone, the legendary amplifier that could bypass the laws of equivalent exchange and, they hoped, restore their bodies. It was a quest for redemption, a desperate, headlong rush towards absolution. Izuku's goal was subtler, but no less passionate. He wasn't chasing a legend, he was chasing knowledge. He had seen firsthand that the greatest danger wasn't malice, but ignorance. It was a lack of understanding that had led to their disaster. So, he would understand. He would fill his notebooks with the knowledge of the world, learn the deepest secrets of alchemy, not to break the rules, but to master them so completely that he could use them to heal, to restore, to ensure that no one ever had to pay the price his friends had. The state's vast, centralized library in Central City had become his Philosopher's Stone. Their training reflected these divergent philosophies. Ed's path was one of power and adaptation. The pain of his new automale limbs had been a constant, agonizing teacher. In the beginning, he had screamed and cursed through the long nights as his nerves learned to interface with the unfeeling steel. Winry, her face a mask of fierce concentration and tear-filled sympathy, had worked tirelessly, adjusting, tightening, and fine-tuning her creation. Pinako oversaw it all with her gruff, watchful eye. But the pain had a purpose. It had hammered Ed's body and will into a weapon. He learned to fight, not just with alchemy, but with his metal limbs. He became faster, stronger, his movements economical and deadly. His clap alchemy, born from his glimpse through the gate of truth, was a part of him now, instinctive, powerful, and raw. He was the spearhead, the one who would break down the doors. Izuku, on the other hand, knew he could never be the spear. His body was not built for it. In the first few months after the incident, he had recognized a critical flaw in his own heroic equation, his physical frailty. An analytical mind was useless if its body couldn't keep up. A brilliant alchemist couldn't protect anyone if he was too slow to erect a barrier or too weak to pull someone from harm's way. So, he began his own grueling regimen. Every morning before the sun rose, he was out on the dirt roads, forcing his protesting lungs and aching legs to carry him one step further than the day before. He did push-ups until his arms trembled and gave out, sit-ups until his stomach burned, and squats while holding heavy scraps of metal from Pinako's workshop. It was an agonizing, unglamorous struggle. There was no flash of alchemical light, only the burn of lactic acid and the metallic taste of exhaustion. Alphonse was his silent partner in this. The great suit of armor would sit patiently nearby as Izuku trained, offering quiet words of encouragement. Since Al no longer needed to sleep, he would often find Izuku late at night in the workshop, poring over textbooks under the light of a single lamp, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You should rest, Zuku," Ael's voice would echo softly. "You'll wear yourself out." "Can't," Izuku would reply without looking up, his pencil scratching furiously across a page. "I was reviewing the geological surveys of the Drachma border region. The soil there has high concentrations of granite and gneiss. My standard earthen walls would be less effective. I need to develop an array that incorporates a preliminary deconstruction of crystalline rock structures before reconstruction. It requires a 3-layer circle with oscillating energy frequencies." His alchemy had become a thing of breathtaking complexity. He had accepted that he would never have Ed's raw power or his ability to transmute without a circle. He saw that lack of a circle not as freedom, but as a lack of precision. So, he embraced his own strength. His transmutation circles were no longer simple drawings. They were intricate works of art, masterpieces of magical engineering. He filled notebooks with them, circles for reinforcing steel, for purifying water, for neutralizing acids, for creating complex interlocking structures from simple materials. Where Ed saw a battlefield, Izuku saw a massive architectural project. He was the foundation, the one who would ensure they had solid ground to stand on. This year of sweat and study culminated in a quiet evening, the day before they were set to leave for Central. The three of them stood before the small, simple grave where they had buried the monstrous result of their transmutation, and beside it, the grave of Trisha Elric. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and violet. For a long time, no one spoke. The silence was filled with the weight of their shared memory. "We'll do it, Mom," Ed said finally, his voice low and firm. He placed his metal hand on the headstone. "I promise. I'll get Ael's body back. We'll be whole again. We'll do it together, brother." Ael's voice echoed, full of a quiet strength that belied his inhuman form. Izuku stood slightly behind them, his own notebook held tight in his hands. He looked at the graves, at the price of their failure. Then he looked at his friends, the living embodiment of that price. "And I'll learn," he whispered, making his own vow to the twilight. "I'll learn enough so that alchemy is never used like this again. So that no one ever has to feel what we felt that night. That's my promise." Their paths were different, but their destination, they believed, was the same, a restored and mended world. The farewell the next morning was a chaotic, emotional affair. Winry, her eyes red but her expression furious, her preferred method of displaying affection, shoved a heavy, custom-made wrench into Ed's hands. "You listen to me, Edward Elric," she said, poking him hard in the chest. "If you break that arm, so help me, I will fly to Central myself and beat you over the head with this. And you," she whirled on Izuku, "stop mumbling and make sure you eat. You're all skin and bones. I swear, the three of you are going to be the death of me." Pinako stood on the porch, a pipe clenched in her teeth, her arms crossed. She watched them with an expression that was equal parts pride and profound sadness. "Try not to get yourselves killed," she said gruffly. It was the closest she would come to saying "I love you." As they walked towards the train station, three small figures against the vast green landscape, Izuku felt the weight of that goodbye. They had a home. A place to return to. It made their quest not just a desperate flight forward, but a journey with the promise of a return. It gave them something to protect. The train ride to Central was like traveling through the pages of a textbook. For Ed and Al, it was a means to an end, a tedious necessity before the real test began. But for Izuku, it was a rolling classroom. He sat pressed against the window, his notebook open, his mind racing to catalog and analyze the changing world outside. The transition was gradual, then sudden. The rolling hills and quaint, timber-framed villages of the eastern region slowly gave way to flatter, more industrialized plains. He saw mining towns scarred into the landscape, their air hazy with coal smoke. He saw military outposts, small and functional at first, then growing larger and more imposing the closer they got to the country's heart. "Look," he muttered, sketching rapidly. "The architectural style is changing. The civilian structures in the east use local timber and fieldstone, resource efficient and adapted to the terrain, but the military buildings are all standardized. Poured concrete and reinforced steel. They're not built to fit the landscape, they're built to dominate it. It's a statement of power. See the way the watchtowers are positioned? They create overlapping fields of fire covering all major roads and rail lines. It's a nationwide system of control." Ed groaned from the seat across from him. "Can you not analyze everything for 5 minutes? Just look at the cows like a normal person." "Cows are fascinating," Izuku retorted, flipping to a new page. "Their multi-chambered stomachs are a highly efficient system for breaking down cellulose. A bioalchemist could learn a lot from." Okay, I get it." Ed threw his hands up in surrender. Al, ever the mediator, patted Izuku's shoulder with a heavy gauntlet. "He's just excited, brother. It's his first time this far from home." It was true. The world, for Izuku, had always been resemble. A place he knew down to the mineral composition of its soil. This journey was an explosion of new data, and he was absorbing it all. He watched the people at the station stops. He noted the different uniforms of the military police versus the regular infantry. He saw the way civilians would either hurry past the soldiers with their heads down or greet them with a familiarity that spoke of a town long occupied. He saw the economic disparity, the bustling, prosperous towns clustered around military bases, and the struggling farming communities that the railroads seemed to have forgotten. He was seeing the anatomy of his country for the first time, and he was already beginning to diagnose its ailments. The military wasn't just an army. It was a skeleton, a vast, rigid structure upon which the entire nation was built. And he was about to willingly graft himself onto it. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. As the train entered the final stretch, the landscape transformed completely. The tracks multiplied, converging into a vast, intricate web of steel. The sky, once a brilliant blue, was now smudged with the gray haze of industry. And then they saw it, Central City. It didn't rise from the plains so much as it conquered them. It was a sprawling metropolis of stone and steel, a testament to a century of military-driven progress. Buildings, taller than anything Izuku had ever imagined, clawed at the sky. A symphony of unfamiliar sounds washed over them as they pulled into the main station. The clang of electric trams, the roar of automobiles, the ceaseless murmur of 1,000 conversations blending into a single, overwhelming hum. The station itself was a cathedral of industry, all soaring iron arches and glass panels. It was packed with people from every walk of life, businessmen in sharp suits, workers in dusty overalls, families in their Sunday best, and everywhere, the ubiquitous blue of military uniforms. As they stepped off the train and onto the platform, Izuku felt a wave of vertigo. The sheer scale of it was a physical blow. Resemble could fit into this one station a dozen times over. He clutched his notebook to his chest, his knuckles white. His muttering, which had been a quiet hum on the train, kicked into a frantic, panicked whisper. The load-bearing columns are pure wrought iron, but the ceiling arches are steel, incredible tensile strength. The logistics of moving this many people, the power grid alone must be a nightmare to maintain. Population density is easily 200 times that of Resemble. Sanitation systems, supply lines. The entire city is a massive, functioning organism. Easy there, Deku, Ed said, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. Ed, for his part, was not overwhelmed. He was energized. He looked at the vast, chaotic city not with fear, but with a predator's grin. This was the arena. This was the place where he would find his answers. He was a small fish who had just been dropped into the ocean, and he was ready to become a shark. Alphonse stood behind them, his great metal body a silent, unmovable island in the river of the crowd. People gave the suit of armor a wide berth, their expressions a mixture of fear, curiosity, and awe. He was their most visible scar, a constant, walking reminder of what they had lost and what they were fighting for. They navigated the bustling streets, following the signs for Central Command. The city was a sensory overload for Izuku. The smells of street vendor food, spicy sausages and sweet pastries, mingled with the exhaust from cars and the faint, ever-present scent of coal smoke. The sounds of 100 different lives being lived at once echoed off the tall canyon walls of the buildings. He saw the posters plastered on the walls, depicting handsome, smiling soldiers and extolling the virtues of military service. He saw the newsboys shouting headlines about border skirmishes in the east and the glorious leadership of Führer King Bradley. He saw the children playing in the parks, their games watched over by the cold, stone eyes of statues depicting military heroes. This city was the heart of the military machine, and its propaganda was its lifeblood. And then they were there. They rounded a final, grand boulevard and stopped, all three of them, in their tracks. Before them stood Central Command. It wasn't a building. It was a fortress, a mountain of gray stone and unforgiving angles that seemed to absorb the very light from the sky. It was a monument to absolute power, designed to inspire awe and terror in equal measure. A massive, circular wall surrounded the central citadel, giving the entire complex the appearance of a gigantic, man-made transmutation circle carved into the very heart of the city. Stone eagles with spread wings perched atop its ramparts, and the crimson and black flag of Amestris, with its wyvern crest, snapped in the wind from 100 different flagpoles. Soldiers in pristine uniforms marched in perfect, synchronized patterns across the vast central plaza. Their polished boots echoed on the stone, a sound like 1,000 relentless heartbeats. This was the center of their world. The source of the power they sought, and the system they hoped to manipulate. Ed stared at it, his golden eyes narrowed, his expression one of grim resolve. Al stood silently, a giant of steel and soul, ready to follow his brother into the lion's den. Izuku looked up, and up, and up, at the monolithic structure, and for the first time, the sheer, crushing weight of what they were about to do settled upon him. He was a boy from a tiny town, armed with a pencil and a handful of theories. He was about to walk into the heart of a military dictatorship and offer his mind as a weapon, all for the hope of gaining access to a library. He felt a tremor of fear run through him, a desperate urge to turn around, to run back to the train station, to go home to the simple, understandable world of resemble. But then he looked at his friends. He saw the glint of determination on Ed's automail arm. He saw the unwavering loyalty in the way Al stood protectively behind his brother. He remembered the promise he had made over a simple grave. I'll learn enough so that no one ever has to pay a price like this again. His fear did not vanish. But another feeling rose to meet it, resolve. Cold, hard, and absolute. He took a deep breath, the city air tasting of steel and ambition. His hand tightened on his notebook, his one true weapon and shield. He would not be the spear. He would not be the shield of armor. He would be the foundation, and a foundation had to be strong enough to support the weight of the entire world, if necessary. Well, Ed said, cracking his knuckles. No point in standing around. He took the first step forward, towards the massive gates of Central Command, towards the State Alchemist exam, towards their destiny. Alphonse followed, his metal feet ringing on the stone. After a moment's hesitation, Izuku squared his shoulders, silenced his frantic muttering, and walked with them, into the heart of the machine. The interior of Central Command was a jarring contradiction. From the outside, it was a brutalist fortress of gray stone, an edifice of intimidation and unyielding power. Inside, however, it was a pristine, almost sterile labyrinth of polished marble floors, soaring archways, and imposing mahogany doors. The air was cool and still, smelling faintly of floor wax and old paper. The only sounds were the crisp, rhythmic clicking of heeled boots, the rustle of official documents, and the low, deferential murmur of voices. It was the sound of bureaucracy, a quiet, efficient hum that was somehow more unnerving than the roar of a battlefield. Izuku, Ed, and Al were led through these hallowed, intimidating halls by a stern-faced major whose smile seemed to have been surgically removed. They were candidates, outsiders, and every uniformed soldier they passed looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled disdain. Ed, with his conspicuous automail limbs and a belligerent chip on his shoulder the size of a small rock, met their stares with a defiant glare. Al, a 7-foot-tall suit of armor, drew overt gasps and whispers, a walking spectacle that turned heads and silenced conversations. Izuku, however, felt like he was shrinking with every step. He clutched his notebook to his chest, his head bowed, trying to make himself as small as possible. This was a world of rigid order, of spit-shine boots and perfect right angles. He was a boy of chaotic hair and ink-stained fingers, a walking embodiment of dishevelment. His mind, usually his refuge, was a cacophony of panicked analysis. The floor is Carrara marble, imported from the West, an incredible expense, purely for aesthetic intimidation. The acoustics of these halls are designed to carry sound, no conversation is truly private. The structural load-bearing is immense. The pillars must be reinforced with an internal steel framework. He was trying to deconstruct the fortress, to understand it, as a way of managing his own overwhelming fear. If he could break it down into its component parts, maybe it wouldn't seem so monolithic. They were eventually ushered into a large, stark waiting room with several other candidates. They were a motley crew, a stern-looking woman with a specialization in botany-based alchemy, a flamboyant man who could transmute gases, and a grizzled old soldier whose weathered hands could turn rock into sand. They all sized each other up, the air thick with competitive tension. Ed met their appraising looks with an arrogant smirk. He was younger than any of them by at least a decade, and he reveled in being underestimated. Izuku, meanwhile, had found a quiet corner and was frantically scribbling in his notebook, triple-checking equations and reviewing material properties. He wasn't preparing for a competition. He was preparing for an academic defense. Candidate 23, Edward Elric! A voice called out. Ed pushed himself to his feet, a confident grin plastered on his face. That's me. Try not to miss me too much. He shot a wink at Izuku and Al, then swaggered through the large double doors at the end of the room. The doors closed with a heavy, final-sounding thud. A tense silence fell over the remaining candidates. Izuku's leg began to bounce nervously. Al's armored form stood sentinel beside him, a silent pillar of support. They didn't have to wait long. Not 5 minutes later, a series of loud, percussive booms echoed from beyond the doors, powerful enough to vibrate the floor beneath their feet. A low rumble followed, like the grinding of tectonic plates. The other candidates exchanged nervous glances. Izuku's frantic scribbling came to a halt, his eyes wide. He recognized the sound signature of Ed's alchemy, unrefined, explosive, and overwhelming. The doors swung open again, and Ed strode back in, dusting off his hands. His grin was wider than ever, a beacon of pure, unadulterated confidence. A wisp of smoke trailed from the examination room behind him. Next, the examiner's voice called out, sounding slightly dazed. How did it go? Al's voice echoed from his helmet as Ed returned to their corner. Piece of cake, Ed said, leaning against the wall with a casual air. They asked me to demonstrate my abilities. So I demonstrated. Made a cannon, made a giant fist, turned part of the floor into a dragon's head. I think they were impressed. You turned the floor into a dragon's head? Izuku squeaked, his voice a mixture of awe and horror. But that's a state-owned building. The cost of repairs, the structural integrity. Relax, Deku. I turned it back, Ed said, waving a dismissive hand. Mostly. Candidate 24, Izuku Midoriya. Izuku's heart leaped into his throat. He felt his blood run cold. He looked from Ed's triumphant face to the imposing doors, and his courage evaporated. He couldn't do this. Ed was a prodigy, a force of nature. He was just a boy with a notebook. You'll be fine, Zuku, Al said, placing a heavy, reassuring hand on his shoulder. The gesture was meant to be gentle, but it nearly buckled Izuku's knees. Just show them what you can do. Show them your analysis. Izuku took a shaky breath. He gave a small, terrified nod, then shuffled towards the doors, his worn boots silent on the polished floor. He felt the eyes of every other candidate on his back, their gazes filled with skepticism. He looked like a librarian's assistant who had wandered into the wrong room. He pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The examination chamber was a vast, cavernous space with a high, vaulted ceiling and a polished concrete floor. At the far end, seated behind a long, elevated desk, sat a panel of 5 grim-faced military officials. In the center was a man Izuku recognized from the files he had studied. He had a simple mustache, a deceptively gentle look in his eyes, and a sword at his hip. This was the leader of the nation, Führer King Bradley. Izuku's blood froze. He was being judged by the Führer himself. To Bradley's left sat a hulking, bald man with a magnificent mustache and an impossibly muscular physique that threatened to burst the seams of his uniform. Major Alex Louis Armstrong. To his right, a shrewd-looking general with a hawk-like nose and a chest full of medals. The other two were high-ranking alchemical researchers from the state laboratories. Roy Mustang was not among them. As their sponsor, he was forbidden from being on the judging panel. Candidate 24, Izuku Midoriya, the hawk-nosed general said, his voice booming in the cavernous room. He consulted a file in front of him. Age 11. No formal alchemical training. No military record. Sponsored by Colonel Roy Mustang. An unusual candidate, to say the least. The previous applicant left something of a mess. Your test, Mr. Midoriya, will be one of restoration. He gestured to the center of the room. There sat a scene of controlled chaos. A section of the concrete floor had been deliberately shattered, creating a shallow crater filled with rubble of all sizes. Next to it, a thick brick wall had been partially demolished, a jagged, gaping hole torn through its center. It was a picture of destruction. Using the provided materials, the general continued. Demonstrate your alchemical skill. You may begin when ready. Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. This was his one chance. He walked slowly towards the pile of rubble, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of their gazes, the pressure of their expectations. Ed's approach would have been to transmute the rubble into a spear and hurl it at the wall. A demonstration of power, but that wasn't him. He knelt beside the pile of broken concrete and brick, his fingers brushing over the rough, fractured surfaces. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, calming breath. He wasn't looking at rubble. He was looking at raw materials. Calcium, silicon, oxygen, carbon, iron. He ignored the judging panel. He ignored the echoing silence of the vast room. He retreated into the quiet, orderly space of his own mind. His muttering began, a low, barely audible litany that was for him, and him alone. Okay, analyze the components. Concrete is a composite material, aggregate, cement, water. Bricks are fired clay, aluminosilicate minerals. The mortar is a mix of sand, cement, and lime. Different compositions, different densities, different molecular structures. A simple reconstruction won't be enough. It'll be weak at the seams. Need to deconstruct first. Break it all down to a homogeneous, powdered state. Then, redistribute and reconstruct, incorporating a reinforcing agent. What's available? Carbon. From where? The air. Carbon dioxide. Can I sequester atmospheric CO2 in sufficient quantity for a carbon lattice reinforcement? The energy cost would be immense. No, too inefficient. Look closer. His eyes snapped open. He ran his hand over the concrete floor, the unbroken part of the floor. Concrete contained trace amounts of carbon, and the bricks themselves, being fired clay, had trace carbon impurities. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. He took a deep breath and got to work. He didn't clap his hands. He didn't slam them on the ground. He took a single, thick piece of chalk from his pocket and began to draw. His movements were a dance of focused, geometric precision. He started his transmutation circle not on the floor, but on the surface of the broken wall itself, the chalk a stark white against the red brick. It was a small, incredibly dense circle, packed with runes and equations that would have looked like gibberish to a novice. From that central circle, he began to draw sweeping, intricate lines that extended outwards, across the jagged hole and onto the floor, until they encompassed the entire pile of rubble. He created a second, larger circle around the debris, connecting it to the first with a complex network of channels and conversion arrays. The judging panel watched, their expressions shifting from boredom to curiosity. The other candidates had created flashes and bangs. This boy was drawing. What is he doing? The hawk-nosed general muttered. Is this an art class? King Bradley, however, leaned forward slightly, a flicker of interest in his eye. He recognized the meticulous care, the sheer density of information being laid out. This wasn't showmanship. This was a blueprint. It took Izuku a full 10 minutes to complete his drawing. When he was done, a massive, intricate alchemical array connected the broken wall and the pile of rubble, a lacy, beautiful, and terrifyingly complex web of chalk. He stood at the very center of it all, a small, unassuming figure in the heart of his own grand design. He took one last look, checking his math, his muttering a frantic, final review. Okay. Phase 1, deconstruction and purification. Phase 2, isolate and concentrate carbon particulates. Phase 3, homogenization of silicate and calcium compounds. Phase 4, layered reconstruction with integrated carbon lattice matrix. All energy conversions accounted for. Equivalent exchange is balanced. Here we go. He placed his hands on the two main nexus points of his circle. He closed his eyes and pushed. There was no explosion. No roar of power. There was only a sound, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the very atoms of the room. A brilliant, emerald green light, the color of his eyes, erupted from the chalk lines. It wasn't a violent, uncontrolled flash like Ed's blue light. It was a steady, controlled glow, like a circuit board coming to life. The pile of rubble began to vibrate. The larger chunks of concrete and brick didn't just lift. They dissolved, breaking down into a fine, swirling gray dust within the confines of the transmutation circle. The dust swirled faster and faster, a contained cyclone of raw material. A thin black stream, like smoke made of solid matter, separated from the gray cloud and was siphoned through one of the alchemical channels towards the wall. It was the carbon, extracted and purified with impossible precision. The gray dust then flowed through another channel, a river of raw material moving towards the hole in the wall. As it reached the edge of the hole, the reconstruction began. It didn't just patch the hole. It rebuilt the wall from the inside out, molecule by molecule. A fine, almost invisible framework of the black carbon dust formed first, creating a perfect crystalline lattice within the gap. Then, the gray silicate dust began to adhere to it, flowing into the empty spaces, reforming into solid brick and mortar. The process was silent, elegant, and utterly mesmerizing. The wall wasn't just being repaired, it was being rewoven, its very fabric made new. When the green light faded and the hum subsided, the room was silent. The pile of rubble was gone. The wall was whole. Izuku stood, breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead. The transmutation had taken a tremendous amount of mental energy. He had held 1,000 different equations in his head at once, acting as the conductor for an orchestra of matter and energy. The hawk-nosed general stood up, walking down from the platform to inspect the wall. He ran a hand over it. It was perfectly smooth, seamless. There was no indication that it had ever been damaged. He knocked on it. The sound was a solid, resonant thud. "Remarkable," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. "It's stronger than the original." Major Armstrong strode forward, his eyes gleaming with tears of sheer, unadulterated passion. "Such precision! Such flawless technique! This method of molecular reinforcement has been passed down the Armstrong line for generations," he bellowed, striking a dramatic pose that made his muscles ripple. Izuku, startled by the sudden shouting, just stared at him blankly. It hasn't," he said quietly. "I just read about carbon lattice structures in a materials science textbook." The general ignored Armstrong's outburst. He turned back to Izuku, his expression now one of grudging respect. "Explain your process, candidate." And so Izuku did. For the next 5 minutes, he explained every rune, every equation, every step of his transmutation. He spoke of silicate compositions, of molecular bonds, of energy conversion efficiency, and the principles of layered reconstruction. He wasn't boasting, he was presenting his research. He was the quiet, nerdy kid explaining his science fair project, except his project had just rebuilt a wall from dust. When he finished, the room was silent again. The judges looked at each other. They had seen power. They had seen flashy displays. But this was something else entirely. This was a level of understanding, of pure, unadulterated knowledge, that was terrifying in its potential. Führer King Bradley began to applaud, a slow, deliberate clap that echoed in the vast chamber. "Brilliant," he said, his voice calm and pleasant, yet carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "Absolutely brilliant. We have seen the sword, and now we have seen the scalpel. One destroys, the other meticulously repairs. Both are incredibly useful tools for a state to possess." He smiled, a gentle, almost grandfatherly expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Midoriya, we are in the business of building a nation. Sometimes that requires breaking things, but it always requires building them stronger than before. You have shown an admirable aptitude for that. Welcome to the military." He stood up. "I believe we have found our new state alchemist today. Let a title be chosen for this one, for his focus on reconstruction, on making things whole and stronger than before, on making them flourish anew. I hereby grant you the title of the Verdant Alchemist." Verdant. Green. Like the light of his alchemy. Like his hair. Like the rolling hills of resemblance. It was perfect. Izuku felt a dizzying wave of relief and disbelief wash over him. He had done it. He was in. He was so lost in the moment that he barely registered the official dismissal. He simply bowed awkwardly and stumbled out of the examination room, his mind a buzzing hive of exhaustion and exhilaration. He emerged back into the waiting room, blinking in the normal light. Ed and Al immediately rushed to his side. "You were in there forever! What happened?" Ed demanded. I pass," Izuku said, the words feeling unreal. He gave me a title. The Verdant Alchemist." Ed's eyes widened, and then a huge, genuine grin spread across his face. He clapped Izuku hard on the back, nearly sending him sprawling. The verdant alchemist, huh? Kinda nerdy. I like it. I knew you could do it. A short while later, they were both summoned into an administrative office. A stoic official presented them each with a small, velvet-lined box. Inside, resting on a bed of satin, was a silver pocket watch, engraved with the Amestrian dragon crest. The symbol of a state alchemist. Their license. Their chain. Izuku picked his up. It was heavier than he expected. The silver was cold against his skin. He held in his hand a symbol of immense power and a lifetime of servitude. It was access to all the knowledge he could ever dream of, and it was a leash. He felt the immense, crushing weight of that contradiction settle onto his 11-year-old shoulders. That evening, they celebrated. They found a small, bustling noodle shop in a central side street, the kind of place filled with off-duty soldiers and tired office workers. Ed, high on his success, ordered the largest bowls they had for all three of them, forgetting, for a moment, that Al couldn't eat. He regaled Izuku with a minute-by-minute replay of his own exam, acting out the part of the dragon head with gusto. Izuku listened, a small, tired smile on his face. He felt a quiet pride, not just for himself, but for both of them. They had done it. They had taken the first, impossible step. Their celebration was interrupted by a shadow falling over their table. They looked up to see the colossal figure of Major Alex Louis Armstrong looming over them, clad now in his civilian attire, which consisted of a shirt that was far too small for his monumental physique. "Ah, the young alchemical geniuses!" he boomed, his voice rattling the chopsticks on the table. "I was overcome with emotion by your breathtaking displays of alchemical artistry today. Young Edward, your raw power is a testament to a fiery spirit. And young Izuku." He turned his tear-filled, sparkling eyes to Izuku. "Your technique. Such masterful control. It has clearly been passed down the Armstrong line for generations." "It really hasn't." Izuku mumbled into his noodles, his face bright red. "Nonsense!" Armstrong declared, clapping a hand on Izuku's shoulder with the force of a friendly meteor. Izuku choked on a piece of pork. "A talent like that is hereditary. You must come and train at the Armstrong estate. We shall engage in manly exercises of physical and alchemical perfection." The encounter was loud, overwhelming, and utterly bizarre, but it was also friendly. It was the first time a ranking officer had treated them not as candidates or assets, but as people. As fellow alchemists. As they left the noodle shop and walked through the gaslit streets of Central, the reality of their new life began to sink in. The city no longer seemed quite as intimidating. The imposing fortress of Central Command was no longer an insurmountable obstacle. It was their new workplace. Ed flipped his own silver watch in the air, catching it with a practiced flick of his wrist. "The Fullmetal Alchemist," he said, testing out the title Mustang had suggested for him. "And the Verdant Alchemist. Not a bad team, huh?" Izuku looked at his own watch, its silver surface reflecting the warm glow of the city lights. The Verdant Alchemist. A name, a purpose, and a promise. He had a long, difficult path ahead of him, a path that would lead him into the darkest corners of the state he now served. But for the first time since that terrible night 1 year ago, he felt a flicker of something he had thought was lost forever: hope. He had the tool. Now, he just needed to find the library. The silver pocket watch was a cold, heavy weight in Izuku's pocket. It felt less like a badge of honor and more like a shackle, a constant, tangible reminder of the deal they had made. 3 weeks had passed since the exam, a whirlwind of bureaucratic paperwork, uniform fittings, and orientation briefings that served primarily to underscore their new status as dogs of the military. They were assigned sparse but functional living quarters within the Central Command barracks, a privilege that felt more like being placed in a gilded cage. For Edward, the initial thrill of becoming the youngest state alchemist in history was already beginning to curdle into a restless impatience. He had spent every spare moment in the vast National Central Library, a magnificent, multi-storied sanctuary of knowledge, but his search for the Philosopher's Stone had yielded nothing but dead ends and frustratingly vague folklore. He paced their small room like a caged tiger, his automail foot tapping an irritable rhythm on the floor. Izuku, by contrast, was in paradise. The library was his heaven. He spent every waking hour he wasn't in a mandatory briefing nestled in a remote corner of the archives, surrounded by teetering stacks of books. He devoured texts on advanced metallurgy, bioalchemy, geological sciences, and architectural engineering. His notebooks filled at an alarming rate, his analysis growing deeper, his theories more complex. He was building his foundation of knowledge, brick by painful brick. For him, the watch wasn't a chain, it was a key. A key to this temple. Alphonse, ever the patient center of their small group, divided his time between them. He would sit for hours, a silent, armored guardian, as Izuku studied, occasionally asking soft, insightful questions. Then he would go and spar with Ed in the training yards, his massive frame providing the perfect, tireless opponent for his brother to test his increasingly powerful alchemy against. Their new routine was shattered one crisp autumn morning by a summons. Not from a low-level administrator, but from Colonel Mustang himself. They found him in his office, a spacious room with a grand window overlooking the central courtyard. He was, as usual, leaning back in his chair with his feet on his desk, an expression of profound boredom on his face. Lieutenant Hawkeye stood near the window, her presence as sharp and silent as a drawn blade. "Ah, the prodigies," Mustang said without preamble, not bothering to move. "I trust you're enjoying your new life as cogs in the Amestrian war machine?" "Cut the crap, Mustang," Ed shot back, his customary lack of deference in full display. "You didn't call us here for small talk. You've got a job for us." A thin smile touched Mustang's lips. "Always straight to the point, Fullmetal. I like that." "Yes, I have a job. Your first official assignment as state alchemists." He gestured to a large map of Amestris hanging on the wall. "This is Uswell, a small coal mining town out on the eastern border. It's a dreary, insignificant little place, but its coal is vital for fueling the trains that supply the troops in the east. Recently, however, production has plummeted. The official reports from the regional commanders cite geological instability and failing mine shafts. Your assignment is a simple inspection. Go there, assess the state of the mines, and write a report on the feasibility of continued operations." Izuku's analytical mind immediately kicked in. "A geological survey and structural integrity assessment?" he asked, his voice eager. "Will we have access to the original mine blueprints, and the region's seismological data?" Comparing the two could reveal. "It's a glorified babysitting job, kid." Mustang cut him off, a hint of amusement in his voice. "A nice, simple, out-of-the-way assignment to get your feet wet. Don't overthink it. Just go, look around, write your report, and try not to blow anything up, Fullmetal." "That's an order," Ed grumbled but didn't argue. Any assignment was better than sitting around in Central. It was a chance to get out, to stretch his legs, and most importantly, to ask around about the stone in a new place. Izuku was quietly thrilled. This wasn't just a mission, it was a practical application. A chance to take his theories from the page and apply them to the real world. He could already feel his fingers itching for his notebook. The journey to Uswell was a stark reversal of their trip to Central. The train carried them away from the sprawling heart of the nation and back towards the rustic, familiar landscapes of the east. But as they drew closer to their destination, the scenery grew less idyllic. The rolling green hills became stark, gray slag heaps. The air, once clean and crisp, grew thick with the taste of coal dust. Uswell was less a town and more a wound in the earth. A cluster of grimy, soot-stained buildings huddled together in a narrow valley, all of it overshadowed by the looming, skeletal structure of the mine's main hoist and processing facility. A perpetual cloud of gray smoke hung over the valley, choking the sunlight and painting the world in shades of monochrome. The faces of the people they passed on the main street were as gray and weary as the landscape, their eyes downcast, their shoulders stooped. They reported to the local military liaison's office, a small, dreary building that was the only one in town with a fresh coat of paint. There they met Second Lieutenant Yoki, a man whose physical appearance seemed a perfect match for his character. He was short and weaselly, with slicked back hair, a pencil-thin mustache, and shifty eyes that never quite met theirs. A large, ornate ring, far too ostentatious for a man of his rank, glinted on his finger. "The Fullmetal Alchemist and the, Verdant alchemist? Yoki said, consulting their orders with a sneer. He seemed unimpressed by their youth. Here for the inspection, are you? Well, you'll find the situation is quite dire. The mines are on the verge of collapse. The workers are lazy and unproductive. A complete disaster. You can look around if you must, but your report should be simple. The town's finished. Shut it down. He spoke with an air of finality, as if their presence was a mere formality. Ed's eyes narrowed, his dislike for the man immediate and palpable. Izuku, however, was cataloging details. Yoki's uniform is perfectly tailored, far above standard issue. The ring is solid gold. His office is heated to a comfortable temperature, while the rest of the town is visibly cold. Economic disparity is evident. Hypothesis: funds allocated for mine maintenance and worker support are being diverted for personal enrichment. We'll conduct our own assessment, Lieutenant, Ed said, his tone clipped. Suit yourselves. Yoki shrugged, turning back to his paperwork with an air of dismissal. Just stay out of my way. Their first stop was the mine itself. What they found confirmed the first part of Yoki's statement. The situation was indeed dire. The support beams in the main tunnels were creaking and splintered, many of them bowing under the immense pressure of the earth. The air was thick with coal dust, far beyond any safe level, and the ventilation systems were either broken or non-existent. It was a death trap. He wasn't kidding, Ed said, running a hand over a deeply cracked support beam. This place is a disaster waiting to happen. It's not geology, though, Izuku murmured, his hand pressed against the tunnel wall. He closed his eyes, concentrating. He could feel the deep, steady hum of the earth around them. The rock strata are stable. There are no significant fault lines nearby. This isn't natural decay. This is neglect. These beams are untreated pine. They should be using reinforced oak, or better yet, steel girders. The support placement is inefficient, creating stress fractures. This mine isn't failing, it's being allowed to fail. Their inspection was cut short when they encountered a group of miners. They were gaunt, exhausted men, their faces permanently stained with black dust, their bodies stooped from years of backbreaking labor. They looked at the boys' uniforms with a mixture of fear and resentment. State alchemists. One of them spat, his voice a hoarse rasp. Come to shut us down and take the last bit of bread from our mouths? Ed, ever confrontational, stepped forward. We're just here to inspect. Inspect what? Another miner interrupted, his voice bitter. The tomb he's built for us? We work 16-hour days for a wage that barely feeds our families, all while Yoki raises our taxes every month to pay for his fancy dinners and gold rings. This mine is our life, and he's bleeding it dry. The story came tumbling out, a litany of exploitation and quiet suffering. Yoki had taken control of the town's finances, seizing the deed to the mine from its rightful owner, a man named Bass Grand, by burying him in manufactured debt and impossible taxes. He had cut wages, eliminated safety measures, and was working the mine and its people into the ground, all while skimming a fortune off the top. That evening, in the town's dreary, run-down inn, the trio held a council of war. The innkeeper, a weary but kind woman, had given them a room and a simple meal of stew and hard bread, refusing payment when she saw their uniforms. You're the first ones from the state who've bothered to listen, she had said. This is simple, Ed declared, pacing their small room. His auto-mail fist clenched and unclenched. Yoki's a corrupt scumbag. I'll go to his office, punch him in his slimy face, and transmute his fancy desk into a pile of scrap. We'll expose him, and the town will be free. And then what, brother? Al asked, his calm voice a counterpoint to Ed's fire. Yoki is a military officer. If you assault him, you'll be court-martialed. They won't listen to the word of a few miners against the state alchemist who just broke the law. We'll be disgraced, and Yoki will just be replaced by someone else, or worse, the military will shut the mine down for good to avoid a scandal. The town will still suffer. Al was right. A direct confrontation was a battle, but it wouldn't win the war. It was a short-term solution that would create a long-term disaster. They both looked at Izuku. He hadn't said a word. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his notebook open on his lap. He wasn't looking at them. He was staring intently at a page filled with a complex, multi-layered diagram of the mine, cross-referenced with geological charts and economic flowcharts he'd constructed based on the miner's testimony. He was muttering to himself, his pencil a blur. "The problem isn't just Yoki," Izuku said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Yoki is a symptom. The disease is the town's dependency. Their entire economy is based on a single resource that is controlled by a single, corrupt authority. Punching Yoki doesn't fix that. To save the town, you don't just remove the parasite. You have to make the host healthy enough that another parasite can't take root." He looked up, his green eyes burning with an intensity that startled Ed. This wasn't the timid, stuttering boy from the barracks. This was the verdant alchemist. "Ed, you're right that we need to deal with Yoki. But we can't fight him on his terms, with violence or military authority. We have to fight him with something he doesn't understand. We have to fight him with alchemy as a tool for economic liberation." He tapped his pencil on the notebook. "I have a plan." The plan had 2 phases, and it required perfect coordination. Phase 1 belonged to Ed. It was the distraction, the flashy, attention-grabbing spectacle that he excelled at. The next day at noon, Ed marched into the center of the town square, clapped his hands, and with a brilliant flash of blue light, transmuted the town's central water fountain into a massive, ornate, and utterly ridiculous golden statue of himself, striking a heroic pose. The effect was instantaneous. Townspeople gasped. Yoki, drawn by the commotion, came storming out of his office, his face purple with rage. "What is the meaning of this, Elric?" he shrieked. "That is town property. Vandalism. I'll have you arrested." "Relax, Baldy," Ed said with a cocky grin, leaning against his own golden likeness. "Just a little demonstration of what a state alchemist can do. A gift to the town." "You don't like it?" Yoki sputtered, his rage competing with his greed. The statue was, after all, made of what appeared to be solid gold. This was exactly what Izuku had predicted. Yoki's greed would make him focus entirely on Ed and the statue, creating the window they needed. While the entire town's attention was fixed on the drama in the square, Izuku and Alphonse slipped away and headed for the mines. They carried with them a large, heavy satchel filled with chalk, surveying equipment, and several large jugs of water mixed with a nutrient-rich slurry of nitrates and phosphates Izuku had purchased from a local farmer. They descended into the main, most unstable tunnel. It was dark, claustrophobic, and the air was thick with the groaning protests of dying wood. "Are you sure about this, Izuku?" Ael's voice echoed nervously in the tight space. "If we make a mistake, this whole tunnel could come down on top of us." "The calculations are precise, Sal," Izuku said, his voice steady and confident. He was in his element now. This was a complex, multivariable problem, and he had the solution. The key isn't just to repair the supports, it's to create a new, self-sustaining system. A permanent solution. He got to work. Using the blueprints he had borrowed from Yoki's office the night before, he moved from one failing support beam to the next. At the base of each one, he drew a small, intricate transmutation circle, each one tailored to the specific stress load and composition of the surrounding rock. It was painstaking, meticulous work. Once the circles were drawn, he and Al moved to the deepest part of the tunnel. There, Izuku began to draw his main array, a massive, beautiful, and complex circle that covered a huge section of the tunnel floor. This was the engine of his plan. "Okay, Al," Izuku said, taking a deep breath. "This is it. The array is designed to do 3 things simultaneously. First, it will use the nutrient slurry as a reagent to transmute a deep, branching root system from the base of every support beam, anchoring them directly into the bedrock. It will also infuse the wood of the beams themselves with silica drawn from the surrounding rock, petrifying them, making them as strong as stone. That will stabilize the mine," Al said, understanding. "That's phase 1 of the transmutation," Izuku confirmed. "Phase 2 is the important part. The part Yoki will never see coming." He pointed to a secondary array within the larger circle. "This part of the circle will analyze the surrounding rock, searching for a specific geological seam. According to my analysis of the region's topography and the miners' own informal surveys, there should be a second, untapped coal seam running parallel to this one, but deeper. This array will non-destructively fracture the rock along that seam, creating a new, easily accessible tunnel. It won't just repair the old mine, it will open a new one. You're giving them a new mine? Al asked, his voice filled with awe. I'm giving them back their independence, Izuku corrected. Which brings us to Phase 3. He pointed to the very center of the array. This final part is the failsafe. It will create a controlled, localized tremor. Not enough to cause a collapse, but enough to shatter every window in Yoki's office and knock over Ed's statue. It will also seal the entrance to this specific tunnel with a rock slide. To Yoki and the military, it will look like the mine suffered the final, catastrophic collapse we were sent here to predict. He looked at Alphonse, his eyes shining in the dim lantern light. Yoki gets his report. The mine is a loss. The military pulls out, but the townspeople, who I've already told where to dig, will have a new, richer, and safer mine, entirely off the books. They'll have their resource back. Yoki will have nothing left to exploit. It's a complete economic reset. It was brilliant. It was audacious. It wasn't a punch to the face. It was a complete and total dismantling of his enemy's power structure, accomplished without a single act of overt violence. Let's do it, Al said. Izuku placed his hands on the circle. The familiar, emerald green light filled the tunnel. The ground hummed with a deep, resonant power. He could feel the alchemy flowing through the network of circles he had laid, a surgeon's scalpel slicing through the earth. He felt the roots growing deep, the wood hardening to stone, the rock fracturing deep below them. Back in the town square, Ed and Yoki were still in a heated argument when the ground began to shake. A deep, subterranean groan echoed up from the valley. The townspeople cried out in alarm. A cloud of dust billowed from the mine entrance. From his office, there was the distinct sound of shattering glass. And in the square, the magnificent golden statue of Edward Elric wobbled, tilted, and crashed to the ground, where it dissolved back into the simple stone of the fountain, leaving behind only a pile of rubble. Yoki's face went from enraged to terrified. A cave-in! The whole mine has collapsed! It was the perfect, chaotic end to the performance. Their official report, co-authored by Ed and Izuku, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. It confirmed Second Lieutenant Yoki's initial assessment. The Uswell mine had suffered a final, catastrophic collapse due to long-term geological instability and structural neglect. It was declared a total loss, and it was their official recommendation that the military abandon the site and relinquish all claims. A week later, Yoki was disgraced. With his primary source of income literally buried under a mountain of rock, he was unable to pay his debts or maintain his lavish lifestyle. He was quietly and unceremoniously discharged. The Elric brothers and Izuku received a quiet commendation for a boring job, well done. To the military, the book on Uswell was closed. But several weeks after they had returned to Central, a small, unmarked package arrived for them at the barracks. There was no return address. Inside they found a lump of the highest quality anthracite coal, polished to a mirror shine, and a simple, handwritten note. Thank you. We have our town back. The first haul from the new vein is on its way to helping Mr. Grand rebuild. We will not forget what you did. Ed looked at the lump of coal, a grin spreading across his face. Heh. We actually pulled it off. Alphonse picked up the note, his metal fingers surprisingly gentle. You pulled it off, Zuku. Your plan. Izuku took the piece of coal. It was cool and solid in his hands. He looked at it, then at his notebook, lying open on his desk to a page filled with complex equations. He had defeated an enemy, liberated a town, and rewritten the future for hundreds of people, and he had done it all with a piece of chalk and a deep understanding of systems. He hadn't thrown a single punch. He hadn't destroyed a single thing. He had analyzed, planned, and then he had restored. Not just a mine, but the hope of a people. A true, quiet smile touched his lips. He finally understood. Being a hero wasn't about being the strongest. It was about being the smartest. It was about finding the fulcrum point upon which the world tilted and applying just the right amount of pressure to move it in a better direction. He placed the lump of coal on his desk, a simple, black trophy. It was a reminder of his first real mission, and a confirmation of the vow he had made to himself. This was the path of the verdant alchemist, and he was just getting started.